But surely. Great. So good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So welcome to this very exciting event today. Our book launch of 100 Years of Greek-Turkish Relations, The Human Dimension of an Ongoing Conflict by Professor Samim Akgönül. So we are very excited about our book launch today, not only because this is the second event of our series of PSA Greek-Turkish Specialist Group dialogues. And this is also very exciting because today this book launch will give us the opportunity to touch upon a relatively understudied subject of international politics. I mean, the human dimension of things, basically. I mean, whenever I teach international politics or, Turkish foreign policy, I like to talk about the human dimension of international developments because I think we as IR scholars sometimes tend to forget the human implications of international developments. I mean, when it comes to wars, armed conflicts, we remember how those things affect individuals, but actually all international developments, international treaties, sometimes agreements, periods of détente, they all have sometimes even unforeseen consequences on individuals. So today, this event will give us the opportunity to talk about this important aspect. And before we move forward with the actual event, first and foremost, of course, I would like to thank Professor Samim Akgönül for making this event possible, and also our very valuable discussants, Professor Bahar Baser from Durham University and Professor Nikos Christofis from the University of Thessaly, and also Professor, last but not least, Professor Seçkin Sertdemir from the University of Turku, who is also a visiting fellow in the London School of Economics, because she actually acted as the technical expert and the Zoom organizer of this event. And of course, we should all thank our friends in the PSA Greek Politics and Turkish Politics Specialist Groups for co-organizing this exciting event. So I'll stop now, and I will turn to Professor Samim Akgönül for a brief presentation of his book. So Professor Akgönül is the head of the Department of Turkish Studies at the University of Strasbourg, and the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. I can't express my gratitude. I'm so happy. I'm so proud. A little bit heyecanlı, if I may say, because actually I'm used to speak online or to classes, but to be with you and to be invited by PSA Turkish and Greek Politics and the opportunity to respond to Nikos Christofis and Bahar Baser's comments, it's a bit scary thing. So I'm a little bit heyecanlı and I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Özlem, you said that as an IR teacher, so the human dimension was coming. It's very interesting. I am not an IR teacher. I am a historian. And then I betrayed history. I did political science, and nowadays I do more political sociology, let's say. But I understand what you mean. I am in a family of IR teachers and researchers, and there is a constant, intellectual tension in the family on this realistic approach, the structuralist approach, and my very modest historian and maybe sociologist approach. Maybe you can notice in this book this tension between IR, core international relations, and the human dimension. This va-et-vient between these disciplines. I wrote this book. I showed the book for the participants. Here we are. The cover is from Sefa Çatuk, a young painter, from his series of Seven Sleepers in Ephesus, and this is called Silence. And when I advertised this cover, my friend and colleague for a long time, one of the leaders of the Greek community of Istanbul, Lativingas, called me immediately, and he said that he could talk during hours on this cover. The silence, this sharing, secrets behind the mountain, the volcano, etc., etc. I think it represents the paradoxes of the human dimension of Greek-Turkish relations. I wrote this book. It depends from where you look. I wrote this book in 3.5 years, 35 years, at the very same time. Book in 1996, when I was young, handsome, and thin, on the Muslim Turkish minority in Western Thrace. As a historian, the book was a history book, but I was dissatisfied by my archives, by these newspapers, by the archives, official archives, and I went to Western Thrace. It was between 1995 and 1996. It was difficult times. I mean, it was the end of the bipolar world. The Rhodope Mountains was still a forbidden zone. I could enter in the Pomak villages, etc. And I took this pleasure to not only to look at the archives, to newspapers, to I don't know, official statements, but to speak to people. And then the book that I wrote at that time, published I think in 1997 or 1998, I don't remember very well, it was a combination of a historical approach and the sociological approach. And since that, each time that I tried to look at the Greek-Turkish relations, I understood Greek-Turkish relations, not only relations between Greece and Turkey, but also between Nikos and me, between Greek beings who recognize themselves as Greek, which is a subjective recognition, of course, and Turkish human beings who recognize themselves as Turkish. So this human dimension was always at the center of my preoccupation while working on Greek-Turkish relations. In 2001, I wrote another book to be able to understand what was happening on the Greek minority of Turkey, of Constantinople, of Istanbul, and Imbros and Tenedos. Well, I think that it's still the only book in Turkish. It was published by İletişim, and I don't know how many editions, maybe 15th editions today, on the Greek minority of Turkey. Still, again, in this va-et-vient between the discipline of history and sociology, between archives and the human dimension, the sociology, interviews, one-to-one relationships, etc., etc. Then, after these two books, at the heart of the Greek-Turkish relations, I wrote another one, that time to understand these traumas, and was on the descendants of the exchange of population between Greece and Turkey in 1920 and 1923. Actually, in many books, we read that it is 1923, Lausanne Agreement of January 1923 that decided the exchange of population between those countries, but there is a chronological mistake because more than a half of Greeks of Asia Minor were already left in 1923. They left in 1920. They went to the islands. They were expecting to coming back, and the 1923 agreement is specifically to prevent them to come back. So I wrote this study also on the descendants of exchange. There too, again, archives and human dimension, interviews, one-to-one relationship, friendships, etc., etc. Then I have to say, I was a little bit far from Greek-Turkish relations, from relations between Greeks and Turks. Life made that I was interested with other topics, other minorities, other concepts, migrations, diasporas. Bahar knows, just nowadays we are publishing a diaspora of the handbook, Routledge Handbook of Turkish Diaspora. So other topics came to my interest, but always somewhere in my small brain, in a corner of small brain, Greeks and Turks, Greek minority and Turkish minority, Muslim minority, exchange of populations. The question was still there. And now, 4 years ago, I was asked, it was an editor who asked me to write a chapter about the minorities in both states. It was the Routledge Handbook of Turkish Politics. So I opened my archives to see what kind of material I can find. What I noticed is the fact that I used maybe less than percent of the interviews that I made at that time, in 1998, in 2000, 2010. So the huge majority of these interviews was unused, was there waiting there. So I decided to restart the interviews. Sometimes I interviewed the same people. 10 years later, 20 years later, 25 years, and 30 years later. Sometimes I interviewed their children, sometimes their other people. So I added a fourth collection of interviews. I added some newspapers to build up this book. That is why I'm saying that it's at the same time a work of 3.5 years, but also 35 years, kind of maturity of the Greek-Turkish relation. By the way, I see how I was enthusiastic 30 years ago, how I am still enthusiastic, maybe it's more, distant. And this distance is better. I see that I was trying, and we are among friends, I can say, I see that I was trying 35 years ago. How I was defending is not seen as my identity. I was in a position of defense of the Greeks' attitude among Turks, Muslim Turks of Western trace, to show maybe how I was far from nationalistic approach. I see that when I wrote for Greeks in Turkey, I took the defense of the minority, and maybe but less distance with my topic. I feel myself than I was 30 years ago. Still I am engaged, still I am involved, of course, still I love these people, but I think that the age made that I could put this distance much easier. So this book is built on the idea of, I don't know how to say it in English. In French, it's partage. Partage means sharing, means two things at the same time. Partage, one object to use it together, partage of something, or the opposite, to refuse to use it together and to try to share it, to split. So this partage was at the heart of my preoccupation in the human dimension of Greek-Turkish relations, because these people, according to the objective, according to the eyes, they at the same time, they share things, many things. They are very, same. Voltaire said, it is nothing else than the sameness. So they are somehow. Today, in my class of minorities and cinema, I showed a piece of the Politiki Cousina of Bulmetis, Tassos Bulmetis, 2004, so 20 years ago, on the Greek minority of Constantinople. And one of my students, who was very far from Turkishness or Greekness, said, sometimes I didn't understand who was Turk, who was Greek. It was confusing to understand, to make it. So a partage, sharing the same thing, same concepts, same vision of the world, same attitudes, same behaviors, but at the same time refuse to share, refuse to use, and trying to split, trying to have this this separation, this partition. Then I took a newspaper, a very interesting newspaper that I found in the archives of the National Library in Paris, Correspondance d'Orient. It is a newspaper published between 1908 and 1945 by two Syrians, two Christian Syrians, who are defending the independence of Syria. If not, that Syria will be a mandate of France. So they are interested in Syria. They are not interested at all in the Greek or Turkish case. But step by step during the Greek-Turkish War, this French, Syrian, Arabic, Christian point of view is changing and shifting. And at the heart of the Greek-Turkish War, it becomes the main topic. Now you can see, it allowed me to see how this war, as a guerre fraternelle, a war between brothers, a war between similar people, let's say the word, as a civil war. The Kurtuluş Savaşı of Turks is not against British, is not against French, is not against even Greek army, against a local population, which is the ancient, regular, normal population of Asia Minor. Then there is a chapter of these muhajirs. Myself, my family is a muhajir from Girit, from Crete, from Retimno, coming to Ayvalık, and I tried to see the descendants of these muhajirs in several places in Turkey, and the shift of identities, these tensions of identities, especially from Crete, but not only from Crete, linguistic shift, nationalistic shift, etc. It was very interesting to me to go back to my interviews of 20 years ago and to do new interviews. And of course, unfortunately, reciprocity obliges. I say unfortunately because reciprocity is a very dangerous topic when it comes to minorities. I also put a specific chapter on polites, on Greeks of Constantinople. That I was just in Istanbul to present our new book on azınlık. You know that Tarih Vakfı History Foundation is publishing 13 books on the 100 years of Republic, and we wrote with Elçin Macar and some other colleagues a collection of articles on minorities, and we presented the book in the garden of the Panaya Church of Uniköy, the Greek community. There are 2,000 Greeks are living in Istanbul from 150,000 who are living in Istanbul of 500,000 inhabitants. We are 2,000 in how many millions? I don't know, 15, 18 million? So what is the population of Istanbul? So a drop in the ocean. It was very interesting to see the reaction, this dynamism, at the same time the lack of espoir for these Greeks. Of course, again, the reciprocity obliges. I went back to my first love, the Greek trace between Evros level river to Kavala and Komotini and Xanthi and Echinos in Rhodope mountains, to see what changed in these 30 years, 35 years since my first book, of these Muslims of Turkish Muslims, let's say, of Greece. As you know, still the same, less, but still the same debate is an ongoing debate on the identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, linguistic identity of this minority, as the minority is shaped between Turkish speakers, Pomak speakers who were assimilated to Turkishness, and Roma and Gypsies who were also assimilated to Turkishness. And I tried to sum up with a chapter to understand the breakpoints, continuities, evolutions, samenesses in the Greek-Turkish relations. It was a very, very useful journey for me, for myself, for my intellectual life, to take the same topics and to go back to these topics. with this new look in Greece and in Turkey, in Greek on Greeks and on Turks. So that is why this book has a special place in my heart. That is why I will listen to your comments and questions and critics with great pleasure. Thank you very much again for inviting me.
And thank you very much for this, very brief and nice introduction. I guess this opened a nice floor for further discussion. And we are, I guess, all happy to see that you have come back to the topic of Greek-Turkish relations after exploring other issues. Okay, so we have two discussants. If it's okay for everyone, we can go with alphabetical order, and we can start with Bahar Hocam, if it's okay for everyone. Bahar Baser from Durham University, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Özlem, and thank you so much, Samim Hocam, for your great introduction. So I'll try to do justice to your book as much as I can, and I'll try to be very brief. Now that I heard your introduction, I just added a few comments to what I've already prepared. So I'll start with saying that when I started reading this book, I was 100% sure that I would see your passion in it, and I saw that. It was almost like I could hear your voice, which words you would stress in a sentence, even, because I know your work really well and I know your presentations. It was a fantastic read for me. I learned so much from it. I would say that people who don't know anything about Greek-Turkish relations shouldn't expect like an introduction 101 to Greek-Turkish relations. This is a different book. This book is built on years and years of experience working on this topic by a seasoned researcher who understood both contexts and tried to present a balanced picture. But more importantly, I could see the emotional labor you also put in this work. I could understand the main objective. The academic objectives were there. I would say to potential readers that this book definitely, makes you challenge the things that you thought you knew. So it challenges what you took for granted, and it also pushes the boundaries at so many levels. So give it like historical narratives, facts that were taught to us in high schools, primary and secondary schools, etc. I'm sure it's the same for the Greek context. So you'll definitely learn something new. And by using variety of resources combined with interviews, you presented a fantastic full picture for us. There's of course room for debate, and we'll come to that. But after you started your presentation with the painting, and now you talked about silence, and it immediately connected some dots in my head, because I was going to ask you towards the end of my presentation. What do you think is different with all the tragedy, quote unquote, we had in the Greek context? Because if you look at the Armenian context, for example, we have denial. Denial is there, and so much money, effort, emotional and material is invested in denial. In case of the Greek context, I see silence. And I mean, can we call this even like deliberate ignorance or just pure ignorance? Is it a secret that everyone knows, but they prefer not to talk about? Or is this enforced amnesia? Because this kind of tragedies, they became part of our national history, especially what happened with, during the independence war, quote unquote, but especially what happened in 6, 7 September, etc. So these kind of things are kind of ignored by the new generations. And after you showed the photo and talked about silence, this really rang a bell for me. Like, can we please talk about this after? Because I think many young people in Turkey now would know a little bit about the Armenian genocide, and perhaps they would know the narratives that would deny it. But when it comes to the Greek case, population exchanges, etc., it's still not there. So let's talk about it. But you also said that you have been talking about this for 30 years, and while you were studying this topic, you were young, handsome, and fit. You still are. But I remember when I was a BA student at Boğaziçi University, we constantly invited you to your talks, especially when we had dreams of EU accession, like membership, etc. And you were the professor who would talk about Lausanne, who would talk about minority issues in Turkey, who would talk about Greek-Turkish relations. And at that time, you still brought human dimensions to the picture, but you would also talk about international relations, political sociology perspectives as well. So that's why I knew I was going to find a passionate author in this book. So you might say that you have written it in 3 years, but it's 30 years of work, and we can see that. And thank you so much for your reflexive approach that you presented in your introductory talk. This wasn't really in the book. I wish there was a chapter in the book where you just talked about your personal journey only for pages and pages. Because I was really interested in understanding, I mean, who you talked to, what stories stayed with you, how working on this topic for many years shaped you as a researcher. So apart from this, I also, when I started reading the book, I wanted to understand one thing. So you started the book, in one of the paragraphs you said, it's important to consider the human dimension as a cultural interaction, not just in terms of conflict. This book takes into consideration, especially through narratives, not only the perception of radical otherness, but also those of similarities and sameness. So I was hoping to find some answers to this question of sameness, and I would interpret it as like closeness with the Greek population as a Turk. No, sameness, I understood what you meant. I wanted to understand, you know, sometimes cultural proximity, either religious, linguistic, etc., doesn't always bring this kind of closeness. So what is also so special about Greek-Turkish relations? There's this love and hate relationship, as you mentioned in the introduction. Why don't we have this feeling, let's say, with our other neighbors in the region? It is specifically with the Greeks. There's something there, and I think the book very well shows this kind of shared tragedies, sometimes enmities, sometimes closeness, sameness, but there is a shared destiny there. Sometimes there, of course, the dispossession, displacement, tragedies, these are asymmetrical between the two nations, but it's always there. And I think the book does justice to these humanitarian dimensions. And you mentioned IR and the discussions you have at home and in wider academia. So I was really happy to see a book that wasn't about international relations for once. I wasn't reading something that's coming from a security studies perspective, or the EU relations and how the Greek-Turkish conflict affects that. It was a fresh look and innovative approach. So I really recommend the book to people who really wanted to understand this dimension. So some quick notes about the book. I really liked the narrative, the style you used in the book. It was an academic book, but it would definitely appeal wider audiences outside academia. I think this was also your aim and intention. So the language you used was really palatable to wider audiences. And the second thing I liked was that each chapter was a standalone chapter, although they, you know, comprehensively created a wider picture. Each chapter was a fantastic read on its own. And I really like the fact that you managed to bring high and low politics together, even sometimes in the same chapter, even sometimes in the same paragraph. So we were talking about international relations, how regional national interest affected the relations between these two nations, and suddenly we would end up with a case study about one individual, which could tell the whole story about what was going on around that period. So I think you have done a fantastic job, and this is an elegantly written book, especially for those reasons as well. So I truly enjoyed it. So the first chapter, Turks and Greeks of Partition and Separation, gave a quick historical background about Greek-Turkish relations, but it was so nice to read your interpretations in between historical facts, and this was the originality of the book. You could show us perceptions from both sides, sometimes supported by interviews, archival material. So you showed us there is definitely a shared destiny at least. So what was interesting was that in one of the paragraphs you showed us that individuals can easily rationalize this kind of imagined national narratives, which were the building blocks of two national projects, and they can easily rationalize their violent behavior or hateful speech based on those othering on both sides. And it immediately made me think about what kind of a Turkey we grew up in the 90s up until early 2000s, how not only we were part of the othering process, our education, the national curriculum at primary, secondary, high schools, we also normalized this othering. You know, we talked about them as the enemy. We learned how to, you know, defend ourselves against the enemy. We had this national security courses, etc. So these stories were there. They were embedded in us, and suddenly there was a change after 2000s, and you also show this very well in the book. But you managed to bring us the stories that are told and how they can be challenged. Chapter 2 was about what you mentioned in introduction, so correspondance Dorian, and I really liked reading this chapter because it gave us how the conflict, quote unquote, could be interpreted by different actors who had different vested interests in this whole unfolding crisis. So Syria was their main concern, and I found two important insights that you mentioned really important. The first one was that the Greek point of view was rarely relayed, you say, in this Western publication. So how do you think it's suddenly changed? You tell us in the book that the narrative changes gradually. So I think the participants of this webinar might be interested in understanding what really changes Western perceptions about Turkish-Greek relations, because it's easier to take the enmities for granted. But how do these change? So I really found this important. And the second issue was that in this kind of archival work, we can find material that is not mentioned in conventional sources on both sides. So sometimes reading those also help us understand the wider picture. So maybe the whole conflict was not all about Greek-Turkish relations, but there were other interests and games in play. So chapter 3 and the consecutive chapter 4, I read them together, although they talked about two distinct communities sharing a common history. So it's about migration, it's about double displacement, it's about double feelings of otherness. You know, these people were forcibly displaced, I would say, but then they went to a different environment. So can you please tell us more about what was home for them? How did they define home? And you talked about integration and local perceptions. So we see that nothing ends with the independence war or the catastrophe, but the ongoing consequences take generations to heal. And you used a lot of quotes from interviews, and you showed us that. So I think especially these two chapters are a great piece of work to help us understand post-memory as well. So what is inherited by the coming generations, how their parents suffered in both contexts in different ways, and can you tell us a little bit, how did healing occur, if it ever did? Because you say in the chapter that integration project has finally worked. So these people became, especially in the Turkish context, they managed to become part of the Turkish society. So did healing occur finally? And also both chapters show us that there is lived experiences of migration, dispossession, displacement, but also the true injuries were not material. So they had a lot of material loss. But the true injuries, you say in the chapter, would be hard to heal because they were psychological and sentimental. So how do you think the picture is now after so many years? Is it still there? Is it still sore? Apart from that, of course, the book shows that these individual stories were really tied to the bilateral relations between the two countries. And although, grassroots attempts are done sometimes to heal the wounds, to move forward, realpolitik maybe did not allow it. So you show it very well as well. And each chapter touches upon the emblematic moments which created collective memories for both sides. And when we read the book, we understand that both sides have created collective memories on what happened with different interpretations. But when I look at the suffering, the level of suffering on both sides, and what's happening in Turkey now, at least in my generation, as I said in the beginning, the silence is there. So on the Greek side, maybe you talk about commemorations, how they still remember 1964, etc. In Turkey, maybe othering brought also alienation. Like these dates maybe do not mean anything for the new generation. So anything that you have to say about this would be great. Apart from that, the last two chapters were more about contemporary politics. So you talk about Öcalan's arrest, and you list all the problems that we talked about since the early 2000s about Turkish-Greek relations. Give it the EU accession, Cyprus agency, etc. So you touch upon IR issues, but you immediately zoom into humanitarian aspects of these problems again. So this was perfect. I would say that when the conclusion came, I could again hear your voice even louder. And I really enjoyed the theoretical discussion that included in the conclusion chapter. What is a minority? What is nation building? Shall we stick to romantic definitions of a nation, or shall we look at the realities on the ground? So these theoretical debates hopefully can be unpacked in your future publications, because I find this kind of interventions, especially coming from the French school, really important. It challenges what we take for granted in IR, mostly dominated by UK or US scholars. To conclude, I just want to say I really enjoyed the book, and I learned so much, and it made me question what is a diaspora, because you use this word, you use transnationalism, and in other publications we see like king communities, as a definition to talk about these nations. But what about their self-definition? I started questioning my own use of different concepts when I started working on erasures from Iraq and Jewish communities from Iraq and Iran, etc. So we refer to them as diaspora because now they're in Israel, they're far away from their home, but they never refer to themselves as such. So do they use this kind of definitions to define themselves? And another question I wanted to ask you was that you worked on this issue for so long, so I'm sure not everything can fit in one book. So was there something that you had to leave out and it felt like killing your darlings? Is there anything you would like to mention here? And then what was the most interesting finding for you? You can work on a topic for 3 decades and you can still be surprised by what you find. So was there an interview or an archival material that made you say, wow, I never encountered this before? And I will stop here, and I'm happy to have an in-depth discussion here or later. Thank you so much for this fantastic book.
And thank you very much for these great comments. And I think I definitely agree with the idea of having a chapter on a personal journey. I think that sounds like a great idea. Maybe, in the next book or in the next edition of this book, why not? And now, Professor Nikos Christofis, thank you very, very much for being part of our event. And now the floor is yours for your comments.
Okay, it's my turn to thank you all the PSA Greek and Turkish groups for the invitation, Professor Akgönül, Professor Baser, Bahar Baser, and all the attendees. Bahar, you made my job here much more difficult because I have to throw several notes, pages of notes. You said so many things that I prepared to say myself. So I will focus on the points that I consider the several merits of the book, right? To put it that. And let me begin with by saying how important this book is in order to understand another aspect, a much needed aspect of the Greek-Turkish conflict relations. That we have so many names, right? Crisis and so on. Especially that during the past decade we have a resurfacing crisis since 2016, more or less, right? Another Turkish-Greek crisis. And to that point, I mean, the first paragraph of the book, of the introduction, Professor Akgönül begins with Tarkan, right? Singing, right, to celebrate the boosting, right, of the Greek troops from Izmir, from throwing, right, the celebration, right, of the liberation. And one might think, following the news, right, it was not very long ago that another incident occurred, right, with Despina Vanadi. If you know the Greek singer, she was invited in Izmir, then out of a sudden said, oh, no, I cannot attend. And then we have a nationalist frenzy from Turkey and in Greece as well, all the bloody Turks, the imperialists, the barbarians, and so on and so forth. And you're just wondering, okay, a century passed, did anything change, right? But at the same time, so many things have changed and so many things remain the same. So allow me just to point out some of the points that I found very interesting, very important in this book. Right, the first and very important point, at least to me as a reader and me as a trained historian, right, not an IR guy, not a political science, right? So I'm trying to find, you know, the different levels under the high politics, and what I enjoyed really much in this book is that Professor Akgönül does not sweeten the deal, right? Not present a biased account, right? No matter how much we try to present ourselves as objective writers or scholars, you can find hints, right? Unavoidably, you choose a side. And in this book, I didn't find that. And I was, I didn't. I mean, because it is a balanced, really well-written and documented book, right? But it is also very careful in its approach, right? Attributes the respective mistakes and wrong decisions to each country, but also does not avoid stating when a policy of Greece or Turkey has been correct, right? And so on. So, and to me, as a reader, again, is that this balanced perspective is a testament to the book's credibility and objectivity, right? Providing readers with a sense of reassurance. The second point I would like to make is the structure of the book. I have to admit that when I was invited, I said, okay, let's read another book, event-based book on Greek-Turkish relations. Okay, let's start with 1922, the Greek-Turkish War. the population exchange, the Venizelos Atatürk friendship in treatment agreement in 1930, and so on. And then I was shocked in a good way, right? At first, I couldn't understand what Professor Akgönül had in his mind, right? How is this book structured, right? But then while you read the book, right, all the pieces started to fall into place. Right? You read chapter by chapter, and then I realized what the author had in mind. So in other words, the book does not follow a mainstream approach, right? The event-based narrative, right? What we call in Greek γεγονοτολογική, right? Gegonos, event, and so on. So instead, we have a book that has a starting point, the Greek-Turkish War, and the different interpretations the two countries adopted regarding the events, right? Μικρασιατική καταστροφή, Kurtuluş Savaşı on the Turkish side, and there Professor Akgönül builds upon it, right? Often, and this is, I really enjoyed it as a historian again, with lengthy references to the 19th century, if not before that, right? So this is something that helps the reader to understand the historical background, right? Greek-Turkish relations did not start in 1922, right? As Professor Akgönül also states in the book. So we have there, from that starting point, 6 book chapters, which I will not talk about since Bahar talked extensively on each of them, right? Just joking, of course. But this unique structure is sure to intrigue readers and make them eager to explore it further. And then we go to the main point of the book, right? The core of the book, right? Which, although the book does not neglect to refer and or analyze state policy, right? The high politics, the main point and also the interesting part, because so many books, IR and political science books have been written on high politics and treaties and discussions and debates between leaders and so on, right? We have the human dimension, right? As both Professor Akgönül and Professor Baser talked about, right? And this is something that we are really, really missing. Also here in Greece, we don't have such books. Only recently, there is an attempt, although it's not a trend, right? But there are some scattered attempts from, it is a bit advertising, but from Dimitris Kamousis, who works at the Center of Asia Minor Studies, and also has access to oral testimonies and ego documents and so on and so forth. So they try, Dimitris Kamousis and other colleagues, to understand this human dimension of the population exchange specifically, and after that. So I think that this human dimension, again, I will say that again, and sorry for that, that it is really interesting to start incorporating in our analysis on the bilateral relations between the two countries, and not only, let me rephrase it, in other aspects of the Greek-Turkish conflict crisis as well. For example, the Aegean, or even more so around the Cyprus issue, right? The Cyprus, I think, what Bahar mentioned about silencing and so on, is a spot-on case, you can find the Greek narrative, the Turkish narrative, and also a Greek and Turkish Cypriot narrative. All of them together, combined, interlinked, in presenting a special case, if I might say, right? For example, when in 1919 went to the University of Cyprus and the Turkish Studies Department, it was a whole new world. It was an open world opening in front of me with Professor Sia Anagnostopoulou and Niazi Kızılyürek, that I learned something totally different about Cyprus. And that was the 1960s. The atrocities, whatever the Greek Cypriots done to the Turkish Cypriots, right? And a decade when my father is from Cyprus, from Girne, right, from Kyrenia, he even did not know what happened during the 1960s, and he was there, right? So, of course, it was very difficult to accept when I was very generally excited when, oh, Dad, let me tell you what I learned in the university. I know these things didn't happen, right? It was also very difficult to accept how we, right, did horrible things to others. Only others in national identity building processes. No, only the other can do bad things to us. We are perfect, and so on, right? Even in the Greek-Turkish War in 1919-22, right? It was the Turks who did terrible things to us, not the other way around, right? And this is how national historiography and the Greek national identity was built, was shaped, right? And even the people who came, the Christian Orthodox who came from Asia Minor, from Cappadocia, and so on, even if they had a different opinion, based on the state policies and the master narrative that was dominant in Greece, forced them in a way to change their perception. So, and since I mentioned Cyprus, I would like to, if you can, elaborate two things, right? The one is that you mentioned the book that the Cyprus issue that was started in late 1950s, right? Why do you choose late 50s and not earlier? Because, I mean, I would place it, if I want to be generous, in 1955. Right? Then we have 1974, right? The military intervention, invasion, the Barış Hareketi, depending again, another point of controversy, the way you see it. It's the trauma, right? It's the trauma of the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots, and how the human dimension was demonstrated, unfolded in Cyprus or in Greece and Turkey, etc. Then, okay, I have one. I think that, since again, to wrap up, to finish, because time is past. I think it would be great if you could include, and in a comparative way, oral testimonies from Christian Orthodox populations that came, right, and contrast them with or second, third generation, perhaps, in a more elaborative way, to contrast and see what both people's populations believe. And the third one, it might be a provocative question. I know that history does not work with ifs or estimates or let's see what will happen if, right? But, and there is always a but that destroys the whole questions, right? How do you think, or what should be done, right, on a state level and on a civil society level, to improve relations that have been worsened again the past decades. Although I believe they were not that bad as they were in previous periods, right? Or to get away from yet another crisis or the escalation of another crisis, even more, I think. So thank you very much. And let me finish by saying that 100 years of Greek-Turkish relations, the human dimension of an ongoing conflict, is not only a complementary book on the vast literature on Greek-Turkish relations, but a much needed book for academia and the peoples of both countries, and should be read widely. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Professor Akgönül, for giving us this book, for offering it. Thank you.
And thank you also for these great comments. And I very much agree, with the fact that the book had a very balanced and objective attitude, and that was great to have in the issue of Turkish-Greek relations. And now we'll turn to Professor Akgönül for a brief response. But before that, let me remind that our webinar attendees can pose their questions via the Q&A tool, the button at the bottom of your screen. So you can put your questions there. And since we are running out of time, Professor Akgönül, if you could be brief in your response, that would be just great.
Anneciğim. It's very difficult to find my way. Thank you very much, Nikos and Bahar. I don't deserve this. Thank you. I'm very ashamed now. Just very quickly to give very short answers. First answer on silence. Silence, Bahar, is the main cement of the Turkish nation building process. We don't say things. Just to give you a very concrete example, after the exchange of population, the first association of Greeks exchanged in Greece, so from Asia Minor, was found in 1924. A year later, the foundation of exchanged Muslims who came in Turkey was found in 1998. You can see this huge gap between the attitude to the past. Turkey, in its nation building process, pushed to silence. Silence must be kept on many things. Of course, the Armenian genocide, of course, the exchange of Oxford, of course, the disappearance of Assyrians and Chaldeans. It vanished. It is nothing. So the silence is a real cement. And even Lausanne is a secret open to the public. No one reads Lausanne. It's a secret. No one says what is written in Lausanne. Second question, the personal journey. You are so right, both of you, on the personal journey. I am balanced between my academic being and my personal being. On the one side, I say that I don't need anymore on an academic book. I can't advance in my career. It's finished now. It's time to write things much more personal. On the other side, something pushed me saying, be academic, use footnotes, don't talk about yourself. And I'm very aware that it should be very interesting to tell the story, the history of my family from Retimno that has an impact of my being, of my point of view, etc., etc. It's a very, very interesting. On the sameness and the cultural proximity, I think that sameness is there, no doubt. And because the sameness is there, there is this hate. I am trying to say everywhere for many years now that the alterity of proximity is always stronger than remote alterity. I don't believe in this formula. They hate each other because they don't know each other. I believe on the opposite. We hate someone who is very close to us. We hate someone that we know much better than the other. If not, we can't explain the Armenian genocide. Armenians and Turks and Kurds were knowing each other very, very well. If not, we can't explain the Yugoslavian war. If not, we can't explain the Hutus and Tutsis. These people, because there is the sameness, that there is the fear of being the other, that there is the hatred. So no doubt the sameness is there. And by the way, we apply, the societies apply what Erik Erikson calls pseudo-speciation, which means to take a community, to put on the margins of the humanity, to justify the massacre, to justify the, I don't know, exile and everything. And this pseudo-speciation can be applied only to neighbors, not to remote population that is not dangerous. Only our neighbor is the most dangerous for us. And this is the case for Greeks and Turks. On the othering, there is a process. It is true that Greeks are not the only other for Turks in the nation building process. There are Armenians, it is true. There are Greeks, of course, Kurds, of course. Arabs is a very important, the Arabity is a very important otherness also. And even I can say that with the rediscover of Kurdishness after the migration process of 1990s, there is, at least in the intelligentsia, this new approach to the former non-Muslim minorities. Oh, Istanbul was so beautiful and multicultural, and now it's full of people. And what people? It became a big village, which is very interesting. I will tell something very, very cynical, very cynical. You will help me. I think that the hatred against Syrians will legitimize the Kurdish minority in the long term. That the Kurdishness will be considered as local, and the Syrianness will be considered as foreigners, because the new minority always legitimizes the old one. The old one, which is there, as the Kurdish minority legitimized the discourse on this rainbow, the colors of rainbow, how it was beautiful Istanbul when these Greeks were there. Self-definition you asked. Actually, there is a self-definition. First of all, polites, so Greeks of Constantinople consider themselves as a community apart. Even their descendants that I met, Eli Urs, as you know, worked a lot on this polites diaspora. I met people from Constantinople in Adelaide, in Australia, in Athens, in Boston, and themselves, they were using this discourse of alterity, of course, alterity towards Turks, but also alterity towards non-Istanbul Greeks. So this is somehow kept, because Istanbul, as we know, all of us, is the center of the world. Your question on what I write more and what is it? I think that there is a missing in this book, very important missing, a very deep sociological and historical work on Antakya Orthodox, Arabic-speaking Orthodox, who are coming in Istanbul and who are challenging the identity of the Istanbul Rum community, which is very, very interesting. A second missing of this book is the diaspora, but of Western trace. There is a very important diaspora of Muslims of Greece in Germany, in France, in the United States, a very active minority, by the way, creating a new discourse on Turkishness and Greekness. It could be very, very interesting. Nikos, thank you very much. So for crisis, there are some crises. There will be crisis because a nation state, by definition, needs crisis. Without enemy, Carl Schmitt, isn't it? Without an external and internal enemy, we can't be. And Greece and Turkey, but especially Greece for Turkey, is a very, very useful enemy. It's close enough, but also we know them. So there will be probably enemies and crisis. But actually, I have the impression that the intelligentsia, the Turkish upper middle class, is not touched so much. Not anymore. Not anymore. The Despina crisis, the flag crisis, was very, very funny. It was a very funny case, but it didn't touch, for example, on the tourism against towards Greece. What changed? I will very briefly in 1 minute. I asked question to my dear friend Vangelis Kechriotis, who died very, very, very, very, very young when we were preparing conference and the book on the expulsion of Greeks of 1964 that was published by Eli Ers. She was the editor. And yes, we were discussing what changed. He said to me, I'm here. Kechriotis is not a descendant of Greek from Turkey. He came in Boğaziçi, he learned Turkish, he became historian, and he said, I think that many things changed. Many things changed in the young generation, and there are many Turks, young Turks living in Greece, and many young Greeks living in Turkey. I think there is hope. And my final word will be for Dimitris Kamouzis. He is my former friend, student. We know each other. He was doing his PhD at King's College. We know for a very long time. Niyazi is my best friend. He was a deputy, so he was here in Strasbourg, very former. But one person is missing in our panorama is Irakli Milla. Without Hercule Millas, Irakli Milla, we couldn't approach this human dimension. He is the first who changed our vision from international relations to the human dimension. Thank you very much for both of us. I couldn't answer to all questions, but thank you very much for your comments and for your interest. Thank you.
And thank you very much for